In the past, it was a staple of kidnappings for the hostage to hold up a newspaper to prove that they're still alive. The problem with me is that I started reading the newspapers that I was holding up, although I'm still, as you can judge by our social media overlords, in captivity. Nevertheless, I'll try my best to get what news I can out to you given the constraints. First up, stories on the domestic news front that I'm tracking. Your briefing begins with the headline, Harvard professor says all hell broke loose when his study found no racial bias in police shootings. The study found that police were more than twice as likely to manhandle, beat, or use some other kind of non-fatal force against blacks and Hispanics than against people of other races. However, the data also determined that officers were 23.8% less likely to shoot at blacks and 8.5% less likely to shoot at Hispanics than they were to shoot at whites. When Fryer claimed the data showed no racial differences in officer-involved shootings, he said, all hell broke loose, and his life was upended.
I collected a lot of data. We collected millions of observations on everyday use of force that wasn't lethal. We collected thousands of observations on lethal force. And it was in this moment in 2016 that I realized people lose their minds when they don't like the result. So what my paper showed, you'll see tomorrow, like some of you, was that, yes, we saw some bias in the low-level uses of force, every day pushing up against cars and things like that. People seem to like that result. But we didn't find any racial bias in police shootings. Now, that was really surprising to me because I expected to see it. The little-known fact is I had 8 full-time RAs that it took to do this over nearly a year. When I found this surprising result, I hired 8 fresh ones and redid it to make sure. They came up with the same exact answer, and I thought it was robust. And I went to go give it, and my God, all hell broke loose. It was a 104-page, dense academic economics paper with a 150-page appendix, okay? It was posted for 4 minutes when I got my first email. This is full of shit. Doesn't make any sense. And I wrote back, how'd you read it that fast? That's amazing. You are a genius. And I had colleagues take me to the side and say, don't publish this. You'll ruin your career. I said, what are you talking about? I said, what's wrong with it? Do you believe the first part? Yes. Do you believe the second part? Well, the issue is they just don't fit together. We like the first one, but you should publish the second one another time. I said, let me ask this. If the second part about the police shootings, this is a literal conversation. I said to them, if the second part showed bias, do you think I should publish it then? And they say, yeah, then it would make sense. And I said, I guarantee you I'll publish it. We'll see what happens. So it was, you know, I lived under police protection for about 30 or 40 days. I had a 7-day-old daughter at the time. I remember going and shopping for it because, you know, when you have a newborn, you think you have enough diapers, you don't. So I was going to the grocery store to get diapers with an armed guard. It was crazy. It was really, truly crazy.
Of course, what he seems to have no consciousness of is that he was bumbling into power and privilege. And victim status confers that upon people. They suddenly get the ability to institute double standards, such as Chabad.org. They write, double standards are supposedly unethical. Yet Judaism, the ethos contained in the Bible and expounded by the sages of Israel, abounds in double standards. In fact, these double standards are at the heart of how we live and how we have taught the world, and at the heart of what makes an ethical person. With all due respect to Chabad.org, hypocrisy and double standards are not what make an ethical person. It's what makes an unethical person. But when you get a victim narrative, you get victim power and privilege, it allows you to basically create one standard for others and a special standard for yourself. And this is what the faculty of Harvard was terrified about. Claudine Gay, who had to step down because of her plagiarism issues, she went after, this study because it basically undercuts the basis upon which she accrues power and wealth and status and the ability to invoke double standards. In other news, the wealthy and powerful are evidently dumping their stock in anticipation of coming market volatility.
Politicians and billionaires have started selling off all their stock.
Senator Tuberville just dumped a huge amount of his portfolio this month, and I mean huge. Out of the 61 trades he made over the last month, 59 of them were sales. Tuberville isn't just your regular congressman. When it comes to trading, he has one of the best records in Congress, right next to Nancy Pelosi. Maybe one of the reasons behind this performance is the crazy amount of Senate committees that he's on.
If you somehow don't know who Quiver Quantitative is, they track the politicians' trades. They have a website. They're one of the best resources you can go to if you want to know what's going on in the stock market and the world. And he points out how Tommy Tuberville sits on a ton of congressional committees that give him insight into what's happening with commodities, rural development, food and nutrition, military action. You can go to quiverquantitative.com and look for Tommy Tuberville, and it'll show you all the data on all of his different trades across the years, whether they're buys or sells, what industries they're in, and you can see what we're talking about here. In February, he sold off huge amounts of stock in every single industry. Just this February, Jeff Bezos has also sold another $2 billion of Amazon stock, and he's up to $6 billion in sales. Mark Zuckerberg is doing the same thing. This is where the SPY is currently at. This is an index that tracks the top 500 and so companies in the market. This was the year 2000, and this was the year 2008, those bubbles. But economists want you to believe that this is not a bubble, that this was the crash and we're recovering and it's all good. Except all the insiders, the richest people in the world, the politicians, for some reason think that this is a really good time to sell all of their assets. We also recently discussed how Bloomberg did a study where they showed that media mentionings of soft landings is actually a reverse indicator for soft landings. The yellow is where we've had major recessions, and news coverage of the possibilities of soft landings spikes before major collapses. And this is what it's at today. We've also discussed how regional banks are in big trouble again, and how the emergency bailouts from 2023's banking collapse end 1 year later, this March. That is in, 12 days?
Of course, whatever turbulence we're going to be heading into will take us over into international news. The above two stories may be related in a way most people aren't putting together. Some years back, I saw a video from a mercenary, a certain Major Dan something or other. He was a former military guy and then a Blackwater mercenary, and he was explaining how there would be civil unrest triggered synthetically in the U.S. by what he called a strategy of tensions. That's the CIA term for divide and conquer. He said that it would be based on what they were calling ancient hatreds. To get us distracted from what was happening internationally, they would trick us into paying attention to racial discord domestically. Why? Because evidently there are going to be big changes taking place abroad.
But I'll start with what we all know to be true is that the world is increasingly descending into chaos and disorder. And from Europe to the Middle East to the Pacific, we're seeing significant shifts in state behaviors, and they are not random. At a recent state visit to Moscow, the PRC president, I won't utter his name, was overheard telling the Russian president, right now there are changes, the likes of which we haven't seen for 100 years, and we are the ones driving those changes together. The changes referenced are a challenge to our security, our freedom, and our well-being. We're seeing a world that's increasingly moving from adhering to rules to prizing national power, from focusing on economic development to emphasizing national security, and from relying on market efficiencies to developing and building national resiliency. Recognizing this disorder, our national security strategy highlights that we are in the midst of a strategic competition to shape the future of the international order.
What he's probably referring to is the threat to the Anglo-American grid coming from China's New Silk Road initiative. Others have noticed it as well. Finance Lot says, notice that every hot region the U.S. is engaged in just happens to be on China's Belt and Road initiative to Europe. Now they're deploying 5 aircraft carriers to the Pacific. This isn't a coincidence. All of these nationalist movements are synthetic and are similar to how the British Empire created the Serbian nationalist movement in World War I to blow up the Berlin-Baghdad railway, because it just happened to be going through that region. And, just like now they're encouraging Ukrainian nationalism to blow up things like the Nord Stream pipeline and to separate Germany from Russia. We've talked about this before. The big geopolitical game for the past 100 years has been to separate Germany from Russia because they're afraid of the geopolitical center of power shifting from the Atlantic to Eurasia. And that will happen naturally. That's where the natural kind of center of the world was. They called it the World Island, which was Europe, Asia, and Africa. 4/5 of global population is there, 4/5 of the resources. The old Silk Road that ran for thousands of years was there. And that only stopped, as we've discussed before, when Islam rises up, cuts off those trade routes to Christians, and Christendom has to find another, kind of venue to engage in mercantile activity. So they sail west. They accidentally discover the Americas. All this wealth flows in from the gold and silver of the Aztec and Inca empires, and the geopolitical power shifts. The center of gravity shifts from Eurasia for the first time in history to the Atlantic. And it's been there for 500 years. If they're not careful, it'll shift back to the norm, which is Eurasia, which is right around where Russia is. And so they do not want that Silk Road built. That will kind of upend everything they've been working for, and especially over a land area, right? They do not want a land route because they make so much money through controlling naval trade routes, right? They get tariffs on every product that goes, through ports and stuff. So if they lose that, then they're going to be losing trillions of dollars, and it goes bye-bye. The Atlantic grid goes away, and that is, it may be weird to us, but that takes us into the news of the weird. In the news of the weird, we read the headline, Lucid Dreaming breakthrough achieved as researchers report successful control of a virtual object while sleeping. The first two-way control of a virtual object by study participants while lucid dreaming has been documented according to the findings of a new research effort. Researchers at REM Space, a California startup, report that 5 participants in the recent study were successfully able to control a virtual Cybertruck while lucid dreaming, and even avoid obstacles that appeared on a screen. Humans spend an incredible amount of time sleeping. The average time spent in restful sleep during a person's life amounts to about 227,760 hours, which equals 26 years, or about a third of the lifespan of the average person. Meanwhile, an additional 33 years of our lives on average are spent just trying to fall asleep. While the human body requires sleep for a variety of reasons, which include resting our bodies and allowing our brains a crucial system reset, many people lament the amount of time spent on sleep that could be applied toward other activities. For their research, the team at REM Space utilized specialized equipment based on electromyography sensors, which detect a person's movements and relay that information back to the computer. It then creates an equivalent action on a virtual avatar. During the study, a Cybertruck was used, for which hand movements by the participants caused the vehicle to turn, and light perceived through the eyelids indicated the presence of obstacles. 5 participants who had experience with lucid dreaming were successful in the conscious control of a virtual Tesla. At the same time, their brains indicated they were in REM sleep, confirmed by polysomnographic monitoring. The dream of despots, to have us working even while we're asleep. From cradle to grave, they can squeeze out any extra productivity from us. And speaking of the grave, that leads us into our obituaries. Charles V. Hamilton, an apostle of Black Power, dies at 94. He popularized the term institutional racism and with Stokely Carmichael wrote a 1967 book that was seen as a radical manifesto. The strategy they envisioned was radical but nonviolent, relying initially on black people recognizing their own self-worth and uniting behind a common agenda. Dr. Hamilton's most important contribution to American history was his exhortation that before a group can enter the open society, it must first close ranks. He believed that for black people to belong to mainstream America, they had to understand that they are black people and not ashamed of that. And with that, I would like to thank you for stopping by the show, or as I like to call it, that suspicious gap in my resume. See you next time. Consider subscribing to my new podcast, Classic Paranormal. It's a clearinghouse for lost real-life accounts of true ghost stories. It's found on Apple Podcasts. Go there now if you're interested in enigmatic tales, chilling true accounts, chronicles from cases of the past that time has forgotten, but that the modern person who likes relaxing by a campfire swapping ghost stories might appreciate. As I said, the new podcast I'm launching is available on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and there's a link in the description below on this video.